So welcome everyone once again to Labster's Science Immersed Conference and to the current session, Unraveling Faculty Burnout in STEM. I'm so glad you've joined us here today. My name is April and I work on the communications team here at Labster. And I'm going to introduce our wonderful keynote speaker, Dr. Rebecca Pope-Ruark, in just a moment. First, we want to say that we hope this session will be very interactive. Our speaker will pose some questions that you'll be able to respond to using Mentimeter, and she'll have some QR codes that you can join with later in the presentation on her slides. But we want to say that all attendees are also welcome to ask questions at any time by typing them into the Q&A panel right here in Zoom. And our Zoom host, Hillary, will read these out loud so that our speaker can respond. And now, it is my definite pleasure to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Rebecca Pope-Ruark. Rebecca is the Director of the Office of Faculty Professional Development at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She's a former tenured professor with 17 years of experience teaching undergraduates and is an experienced facilitator and certified coach. She's also the author of 2 books. One is Unraveling Faculty Burnout, Pathways to Reckoning and Renewal, published by the Johns Hopkins University Press in 2022, and Agile Faculty, Practical Strategies for Managing Research, Service, and Teaching, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2017. And in addition to her writing and teaching, she is also the host of the Agile Academic, a podcast for women in higher education. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your presentation, Rebecca. The floor is entirely yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, April, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak with you all today. Greetings from Atlanta, Georgia. Happy to be here with you today to talk about this topic that is near and dear to my heart, which I'll explain a little bit more about. And we have a full agenda for the hour, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you. And I will have access to the chat. I'll ask you to use the chat occasionally to share some thoughts as well, in addition to the Mentimeters where you can use your phone to scan some QR codes. So I'm going to take a second and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so our topic for today is unraveling faculty burnout, specifically in STEM. So, obviously you're here as STEM instructors, so we want to think about this particular topic from that perspective, and we're going to think about this from the perspective of STEM as a culture in higher education and what that looks like and what that means when we think about this concept of burnout. So our agenda for today is really fourfold. We're going to think about really what burnout is. So we're going to look at it. There is a clinical definition of burnout. There is a diagnosis. So we're going to look at what that is and what the signs of burnout are. We're going to think about how we can identify burnout in ourselves and in others and what that means to do that. We're going to understand burnout as a culture problem. We're going to look at this particular syndrome, this mental health syndrome, as something that's caused by the culture, a culture of high stress, what that means as we think about ourselves and our well-being, but also what it means for our workplaces. And then we're going to think about burnout through these lenses of connection and balance, and specifically what that means in a STEM-centered workplace. So April introduced me a little bit. I have a couple of books out, including my book, Unraveling Faculty Burnout. But why am I even here talking to you about this? Where did the book come from? What does that even look like? So I want to take you back just a little bit. So this is me about 8 years ago in 2016. And I was just your normal faculty member, right? I was at a teaching-focused undergraduate liberal arts institution. I wanted to be a teacher's teacher. I loved working with students. I was mentoring students in undergraduate research. I was doing student-focused research and teaching research as part of my research load. It was really the kind of institution I wanted to be at. I really kind of dove into that mentality and really was engaged and fully dived into that work. I had been at my institution for about 10 years, and I started, really thinking that I needed to do more. And, the pressure starts to build, right? You feel like you have to catch up with everyone else. I started thinking that I wasn't having enough leadership roles, or there were people ahead of me who were doing more than I was, and I needed to catch up, or I needed to have a better book and a better publisher, or that I needed to just do the next thing because people were ahead of me and I needed to catch up. So that started kind of a trend of stress, that I just kept getting these messages that I needed to do more, and I needed to catch up, and I needed to do more, and I needed to do more. And over time, that really started to wear on me, and I started to feel certain things, and I started to see certain behaviors in myself that were very not like me. I started to really kind of pull back from my students, right? If my students were really my pride and joy for a very long time, for the 16 years of my career, but I started finding myself avoiding them. I started finding myself running away and hiding from them in stairwells, or shutting my door and not wanting to talk to them, and thinking very negatively about them, being very cynical about what they wanted from me, being very cynical about my colleagues and the work that we were doing. And really, I found myself having difficulty getting out of bed in the morning, really not wanting to go to work at all. I was exhausted all the time. I was sick regularly. I was constant migraines. I was sinus problems. I was back problems. I was constantly sick. And I was really finding myself having a lot of difficulty doing some of the work that I loved. I'm a writer, and for a long time, I wasn't able to really put pen to paper. I wasn't able to write at all. So I was going through this really serious experience where I was ultimately diagnosed with burnout. I had pushed myself so hard in an environment of high stress that I had gotten to a clinical point where I just kind of cracked, and I couldn't go through it anymore. And again, I was just your normal average faculty member, but in some ways I was like a canary in a coal mine. And I think there are a lot of us who are these people that we have to be looking out for, that we have to be looking for these folks who are going through these experiences, because they're telling us something about our culture in higher education, and they're telling us something about our workplaces specifically. So who are these folks, and what are they experiencing? What are we looking for when we're looking for this thing called burnout? We know there's been a lot written in a lot of the higher education press, in the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed, about burnout lately. There's been a lot, especially since the pandemic, there's been a ton written about this concept of the Great Resignation, and people moving kind of out of higher education because of the stress and because of a lot of the cultural elements. So I think it's a real kind of cultural moment for thinking about this experience of burnout. But I think we throw the word around a lot too. So what does it even mean when we're talking about burnout? We do have a clinical definition. So let's take a look at what that is. So the World Health Organization in 2019 defined burnout as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. There's a couple things going on in that definition. The first thing is the word syndrome. So the World Health Organization is not defining burnout as a mental illness per se. They're calling it a syndrome, which essentially means it's a collection of symptoms that can cause mental distress, or that can lead to a mental illness, other mental illnesses, if you're prone to those. So if you're like me and you're prone to things like depression and anxiety, it can exacerbate those things, or other things like OCD, things that are comorbid, can be present. It can be exacerbated if you start to move into a burnout experience. So not necessarily a mental illness, but a syndrome that can cause or exacerbate other mental illnesses. But the core word in this definition is workplace. It comes from chronic workplace stress. So we're talking about an experience, a mental stress experience that is caused by stress from the workplace. Now, it's a function of a definition that we put, boundaries around things. And obviously your, stress from the home can impact the way you work, and work stress impacts your life at home. But we're really talking about an experience here that is a direct result of chronic unresolved workplace stress. So what we're looking for when we're looking for burnout are three main characteristics, and all three of these need to be present for a diagnosis of burnout. So the first thing we're looking for is chronic exhaustion or feelings of energy depletion. So we're talking about long-term exhaustion here. We're not talking about, at the end of a semester, you're feeling really tired and you need to reboot. We're talking about something that's long and sustained over time. So for me, in my experience, this was multiple semesters. This wasn't something that I was bouncing back from. This was pretty consistent. I would get some rest and maybe feel a little bit better, but then it would come back pretty consistently over time. So this exhaustion can be mental, emotional, physical. It can be all of those things at once. And it often is when you get into the more serious levels of burnout. So it's this real feeling of kind of chronic and sustained levels of exhaustion or not having energy for the work that you have to do. The second thing we're looking for is increased mental distance or cynicism toward the job. So I mentioned feeling really cynical about my students, feeling like they were just kind of problems that were in my way. I didn't have a lot of, sympathy for them or empathy for them anymore. And that became a real problem for me. This idea of increased mental distance, when you think about the early burnout research that was done in the 70s and the 80s, it was done initially with healthcare workers and teachers and social workers, so caring professions. And when you think about those folks, these are people who work very closely one-on-one with individuals, with their clients or with their patients, with their students. And what they were finding in that research was that these people were creating mental distance between themselves and the people that they cared for to protect themselves. So instead of a nurse, for example, seeing a patient with cancer, they just started seeing cancer so that they didn't have to see that person's pain. They just started thinking about that person as an illness and could just focus on the illness. So they were increasing the mental distance to kind of put some personal safety or personal kind of distance between them. So that's one way of thinking about it. You can also see cynicism kind of directly related to the job. So I was starting to get really cynical about committees. We all have those cynical colleagues, but you see the people kind of get cynical over time, right? And people who get cynical, who start thinking about, this committee work is useless, nothing ever happens. Why do we do this? I've had faculty who are burned out, tell me that higher ed's a sham, or that faculty governance is a sham. It's, that it's pointless, that it's just, it's just a cover up for making us feel like something is going to happen when the administration is going to do whatever they want to do. Right. So we start to see that cynicism really creep in and stand out. And cynicism is a real problem because it can be really contagious among colleagues. So we want to be on the lookout for that. So we're looking for exhaustion, and we're looking for that increasing mental distance or cynicism. And then the third thing we're looking for is reduced professional efficacy if we're going to diagnose burnout. And this can mean two things. It can mean actual reduced professional efficacy, like you're not able to do your job well anymore, or perceived reduced professional efficacy. So for me, it was both of those things. I was not able to do my job well anymore because I was not writing. And that was, writing is my field. I am a writer, and I was not able to do that writing anymore. If I didn't write for about 2 years. And I also felt like I wasn't able to do my job well. I felt like I wasn't teaching well. I felt like I wasn't showing up in the same way that I had shown up in the past, even though that there was no reflection of that in my teaching evaluations or how my colleagues were interacting with me. So you may feel like you're not able to do your job well anymore, and that may be accurate or not accurate. So those are the three things that we're looking for when we're looking for burnout. So I'm just curious, maybe in the chat, if you just want to maybe jot, how does that definition land with you? Is that connecting with you? Or, how does that resonating specifically with you? Or what questions do you have about that definition? If you just want to use the chat instead of the Q&A here, I can see the chat right now. Just maybe drop in kind of a thought. How's that resonating, or how is that definition landing with you? Okay, Leanne's been here before. Other thoughts? Isabel says it's accurate. Yeah, it says you've experienced it. Okay, so folks are connecting to that definition in their personal experience. Okay, Stephanie sees it around her. Hannah said that's spot on. Shanna said that's very accurate. Still dealing with it. Yeah, it's a process. And I think it's actually really unique in higher education because it's because we have semester breaks, right? You know, for those of us who are on 9-month contracts versus 12-month contracts, I think it's a little different. But even when we have semesters, it's like you get a little bit of a break, or you at least get a change. You get something different every 14 weeks if you're on a semester, right? So it feels like you get a break and you kind of can reboot a little bit, but it's still exhausting, and it's still something that just is consistent. So the stress never really goes away. So that's that can be different. Yeah. So Leanne found that participating in activities for self-help like music can be useful. Oh yeah. So yeah. So you pull away from those activities that can be useful. Yeah. 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 So part of that exhaustion and depletion is you start pulling away from the things that keep you well. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Okay, so we're connecting to that definition. So I wanted to check that. So I also want to check, I want to think about these couple of questions too, and we can do this in the chat as well. So thinking about that definition, I'm curious, how prevalent do you think that the burnout might be among STEM faculty specifically? What's going on there? And how might it be impacting, if it is prevalent, how might it be impacting teaching and learning specifically in STEM courses? How is it maybe showing? So do you think it's prevalent in the disciplines, and how might it be showing up? We can use the chat for this as well. So do we think it's prevalent in STEM for STEM faculty? Shannon says trying to balance the lecture, the lab, the research is complicated. Yeah. Leanne said that's very prevalent. Okay, a lot of lab. Okay, so folks are mentioning labs, adding so much time, prepping for labs. Budget stuff causes it for the labs. Disengaged students can lower morale. Other thoughts? Okay, preparation can be an issue. Yeah, and preparation can impact, faculty morale. Absolutely. Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay. So I talk to a lot of faculty at a lot of institutions about burnout, not just faculty in STEM, and it's burnout is widespread across institutions and different types of institutions. It's not a specific type of institution or that's serving a certain population. It's widespread across institutions in this country. So it's especially coming out of the pandemic. There was a lot of a lot happened in the pandemic that led to folks taking their well-being a lot more seriously, or feeling betrayed by how things happened, or how administration acted or dealt with some of the issues of the pandemic. So burnout is widespread, and it's been difficult to come back from that and to find footing after that as well, because things have just kept rolling, right? And things have not necessarily, we learned a whole lot from the pandemic, but we didn't make a lot of changes, unfortunately. So there's a lot impacting teaching and learning, and we're seeing, changes in students and the student population, what they're bringing to the table as they come in, having had the gone through the pandemic themselves when they were in high school and missing a lot of experiences. So I'm seeing a lot of burnout. I'm seeing a lot of cynicism. I'm seeing a lot of negative attitudes, and folks are still just exhausted, right? We haven't had a refresh from that experience. We've just kept moving and rolling on. So we're seeing a lot of it coming, and we're seeing a lot of it impacting institutions broadly, and institutions not doing much about it or not knowing what to do about it. So, but I want to go back to that definition and remember that burnout is a workplace culture problem that impacts individuals. It's not an individual problem that you bring to the workplace. It's caused by the workplace and impacts an individual, and that individual is in a workplace. So when we think about the culture, I would love to get some feedback from you to think about how would you describe the culture of STEM in higher education? So if you take your phone, and you can use your camera on your phone to scan this QR code, it'll take you to a Mentimeter, and I'd like you to describe what you think the culture of STEM is in 3 words. So you can enter 3 words in the poll, and we'll develop a word cloud so we can learn a little bit more about what you think about the culture of STEM in higher education. So I'll give you a minute to go ahead and scan that QR code with your phone and enter your words, and we'll see what we've come up with. We'll pull up that in just a minute. I'll give you some time to use that QR code. Okay, I'm gonna escape out of here and go to the Mentimeter. Okay, we've got some words coming in. Give another minute for folks to respond. Okay, some really interesting responses here. We see that word demanding being the kind of the core word, that biggest word. So that culture is really demanding. We see words about like unrelatable and unrepresented, uncertain, and then words like crazy, chaotic, stressful, too much. And things about not enough time, misunderstood, underfunded. Okay. Okay, so if we were going to put those into groups, we might keep that demanding as kind of a core group. And then those words like crazy and chaotic fall under that. And then we've got some misunderstood kind of words. But then we've got, there's one word, one rewarding word. We've only got kind of one word in there. Maybe the diversity word. So we've got some really interesting responses as well. We've got some coming in the chat as well. So some hands-on, continuous improvement, ethical responsibility. Okay, so some really interesting thoughts on what the culture of STEM is in higher education. So I want to ask you another question as we think about what the culture of STEM is as well. Would we define STEM in higher education as a high burnout culture? Yes or no? Go ahead and just put a yes or no in the chat. Do you think you would define STEM in higher education as a high burnout culture? Yes or no? We've got yeses and some no's. More yeses right now. We've got a few more yeses than nos in the responses right now. So what does a high burnout culture look like? There's a researcher out of New Zealand who's been doing some really great work recently on burnout, and he's been looking at it from the individual perspective and from the organizational perspective as well. So he's not doing necessarily specifically work on higher education, but he's looking more broadly, and he's been doing some really good stuff. And he has come up with a list of characteristics of a high burnout organization, and this is his list. So a high burnout organization has high workload with insufficient resources, a fear of culture, threat, or emergency, treating people like they're expendable, a system designed for insecurity, lack of support from above, the talk doesn't match the walk, and we don't talk about burnout here. So there are some similarities to higher education broadly in this list. I think you could probably argue that this is kind of late stage capitalism in general. But typically when I share this list with folks in higher education, you get some, knowing nods that this is pretty similar to what we know in higher education. And some of these words match up with what you had in your word cloud too, right? The insufficient workload, or the workload and the insufficient resources, some of those things match up as well. So we're in organizations often that have cultures that lead us to burnout, right? And higher education is a culture of competition. It's a culture of, making sure you're living up to really high expectations, of nothing ever really being good enough, needing to do the next thing always. It's a kind of a constant expectation escalation. So that's the culture that we live in higher education. And it's more difficult as well because academics are trained to think of your identity as an academic above all else. So it becomes your kind of personal identity, even in your personal life as well. It becomes kind of your overarching identity. So it becomes really difficult to separate identity from work overall. And when we're in these high burnout organizations, it's really difficult to separate and to have the balance that you need to be able to manage life successfully and not fall into burnout. So I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of culture specifically. So a couple of years ago, Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter released a book called The Burnout Challenge. And Christina Maslach is one of the original burnout researchers. Her name is attached to the Maslach Burnout Inventory, which is the primary research tool that we have for identifying levels of burnout in individuals. If you're interested in kind of your own level of burnout, there's some free versions of that and a $15 version. If you search for Maslach Burnout Inventory in Google, you can find those. And this is a really interesting book if you're a people leader. They talk really specifically about culture issues and what are some of the specific culture misalignments that lead to burnout. So where's the misalignment between the person and the organization that causes the burnout? So they have in their research determined 6 of these misalignments, and these follow along these lines: workload, control, reward, community, fairness, and values. And I'm going to articulate those a little bit more. So for workload, it's pretty much what you would expect, right? The manageability of your task load, obviously. And this is a core one in higher education. And part of that is in some ways due to what I call the curse of the competent, because if you think about it, once you show yourself competent in something, you will get more of that work loaded onto you. So if you show yourself competent in, governance or some sort of committee work, you will continue to get more of that work loaded onto your plate because you're good at it. So the manageability of your task load. But also opportunities for recovery after periods of high stress. Like I said earlier, it seems like we have periods of recovery because semesters end and it seems like there are breaks, but we all know that there are things that fill up those breaks: prep, research. We may not have a long break if we teach over the summer, for example. So there often are not times where there's balance or where there is time for recovery from high stress periods or long projects or things like that. So managing the workload is what's possible. When we think about control, we think about the autonomy that we have over how we use our time and our resources, and we think about flexibility conditions. So this has been a real hot topic in higher education since the pandemic. Faculty, to a certain extent prior to the pandemic, were pretty flexible in terms of where and when we did our work. And that was stricter for STEM faculty who needed to be in labs and things like that, for classes and for your work. And it became a lot more guarded, maybe is a word that we could use when we came back for the pandemic. Administration wanted to know where we were and wanted us to be on campus more. So flexibility became a kind of a buzzword. Where do we work? When do we work? How often are we on campus? So control and our autonomy it can be a question of burnout. Rewards, when we think about rewards, yes, we think about social recognition, so actual awards. We think about extrinsic rewards. So we do think about salary. Salary matters. Salary tells us how respected we are to some level. But it also includes fulfillment in the job that we do. It also it manifests in your autonomy and how you feel like you're competent in your job and you get fulfillment from that. So how is that playing out as well? Community, this is a really important one. Do you feel like you have a belonging in the community, civility in the work that you do, or do you have respect among your colleagues? Is there a supportive social environment? This one is really interesting in higher education. There's a lot of evidence and there's a lot of anecdotal examples of departments, for example, that can be really congenial folks outside of department meetings. And then when you get into department meetings and people just get vicious, a lot of divisions, a lot of, just kind of antagonism, right? So are people civil to each other? That's just a kind of a core level of collegiality, might not be visible. So thinking about not just feeling belonging, but are people just respectful and civil to each other? That can be a really important factor in whether we feel burned out or not. And it certainly was a core factor in my burnout as well. And then we think about fairness, we think about reciprocity, how things are distributed, whether that's resources, how resources are distributed, how course times and course schedules are distributed, equity, collaboration, how those things are distributed. And then we think about values. We think finally about, are our values aligned with purpose? Are we given meaningful tasks? Do we trust our colleagues? Do we trust the administration? And do we feel like the organization is behaving with integrity and asking us to behave with integrity as well? Those things can be at odds. So those are the 6 areas where Maslach and Leiter have, in their research, have found that those are the core areas of misalignment that can lead to burnout in a culture for individuals. So what I'd like you to do now, I have another QR code for you, and I would like you to think about higher ed kind of STEM broadly. What does higher ed STEM do right in these areas? What are some shining examples? And you might think about this at your institution, or you might think about this in your discipline or kind of broadly. When we think about these 6 areas, what's an example of something that's being done right, that looks good, that is an example that other institutions might be able to take and use? So go ahead and scan that QR code and see if you can add an example of something that's being done right based on one of these examples. Where's a good thing happening? So I'll give you a few minutes to go ahead and do that. Okay, I'm gonna escape out of here. Go to the slide. Okay, so we have a couple of responses. So STEM does support students well, provides great training for thinking through problems, persistence, and perspective, and being able to bring experience to sessions. Making sure labs and lectures are consistent across the board and support, again, supporting students. Okay, great. Other thoughts? So supporting people, supporting students, really great training. Any other thoughts before we move on to the second question? In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the second question, which I'm sure you can imagine what's next. I want to think about how might higher ed STEM, this higher ed STEM community, you can think about your institution, or you can think about kind of your discipline or something more broadly. What's one area that might be good that might be a good place to make a change? Or what's, what's a low hanging fruit or a place where a change could be had that would make a difference? So how might or where might higher ed STEM address one of these misalignments? So I'll give you another couple of minutes to, this is a new QR code, new question, new QR code. Go ahead and scan that QR code and just brainstorm what's something we could do to make a change that might impact positively burnout in an institution or in the disciplines. So I'll give you another couple minutes for that. I'm going to escape out. Okay, we have some responses coming in. Okay, so provide some freedom for faculty to do their jobs without fear. So there's that control piece. So respect to new instructors, be flexible. So control again, recognize faculty as professionals, increase flexibility. So there's control seems to be a big theme here. Communication and support, being mindful of areas of strength and challenge. Okay, yep. Equality of leadership should listen to the faculty. Okay. So we want expertise to be recognized, communication. Okay, great. Yeah. So I see that definitely that control one really coming out. Control, and communication. That equity, fairness piece. Any other thoughts before we go ahead and move on in the interest of time? Really interesting which of these are standing out. Okay, well, these QR codes will stay live and you'll have the recording. So if you want to go back in and add some, and I'll make sure that April has the links to the results that she can share with y'all so you can see those as well. So let's go ahead and go back to the slides. So I want to move on and think about this idea of burnout resilience. So let's move into the kind of the last section of our talk today. So in my research for my book, Unraveling Faculty Burnout, I did a lot of interviews with women faculty mostly who were experiencing burnout or had moved through burnout or had made decisions based on their burnout, what to do with their higher education career. And what I found mostly was that there were really four paths that people were, or four lenses that people were looking at their burnout through that were helping them move through or build burnout resilience. And those lenses were purpose, compassion, connection, and balance. And we're going to look at two of those lenses today. We're going to look at compassion and we're going to look at balance. So connection really connects to the community piece of Maslach and Leiter's misalignments specifically. So when we think about connection, we think about obviously connecting to people. We know how that we're wired for connection. That's who we are as a species in that. But we're also wired to connect to things like to nature, to our, hobbies that we value, wildlife, animals, that we care about, to a higher power if that's important to you. So having connections to things that we value becomes really important in the workplace and helps us balance, our lives and our emotions as well. So some questions to think about when we think about connection, and I'm just going to kind of skim through these a little bit in the interest of time, but you'll have these that you can go back to and do some reflection. Think about the workplace relationships that you value and what is most valuable about those relationships for you. What do you value most about relationships with students? How does that bring value and joy to your life? How might you lead into those connections now when you're feeling burned out? How might those connections bring some relief or bring some joy into life? And what are some of the connections that you might be avoiding or ignoring right now that might, why might that be? What might you do about that? Is it necessary to attend to those particular connections? How might that help? But I want to do a little activity while you're thinking right now. So I want you to think about connection. Let's just think over the last year and think about your connection relationships at work specifically. So I want you to think about connection and how you have felt in making connections and community with other people in the last year. So what have you liked about your level of connection? What have you learned about your level of connection? What have you longed for? And what have you lacked in your level of connection? So I'm going to give you a minute to just jot down some thoughts, and we'll come back and we'll do like another level of this. So what have you liked about your level of connection? What have you learned? What have you longed for? And what have you lacked? So you can just jot down some thoughts in the chat if you like. That's a good way to capture it, capture some notes. So I'm going to give you 1 minute to just jot some thoughts down when you think about your level of connection in the last year with relationships at work. Go ahead and just type that in the chat. Gonna softly in. Okay, some really interesting responses coming in. A lot about building relationships and the importance of relationships and communication, the importance of communication, when to lean on people, when not to. Okay, so we're got some lack of resources as well, impacting our ability to get things done. Okay. And that kind of leads me to the next point was, should we, how can we be thinking about ways to use connection to mitigate burnout? How can we address some of the negative pieces or the things that we longed for or lacked? What are some things that we can do to address those issues? So maybe brainstorm some examples again in the chat, or some things we can do to address that. Any thoughts for ways to engage, to create more connection, or to address some of the lacked or longed for? Okay, talking directly to people. Okay, some group coaching sessions. Okay. Yeah, sometimes just that common humanity, knowing that you're not the only one, can be really important. So that can be among faculty, that can be among your lab groups, both of those things, any kind of group of people, finding that common humanity can be really important and really validating. So that's a great way to do connection. Yeah. So I encourage you to think about different ways that you can build connection, and it can be through stronger ties. Okay, Diane longs for stronger ties. So thinking about ways that we can build those things, look for different ways that might be coming together in person. It might be coming together online. Look for common ties, ways to build those bonds, because connection, like I said, we're wired for connection and we long for those things. So the more we can do to create those connections, the better. And that helps overcome burnout because we feel that sense of belonging, which is super important. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on. We only have a couple more minutes, so I want to kind of get through the balance piece as well, because I have some specific advice here. So I want to talk about balance, and this plays into the workload and the fairness pieces in the Maslach area. So one of the reasons I like this quote, because I think when we talk about balance, people often roll their eyes because there is no magic work-life balance. And what we're really often talking about is satisfaction or dissatisfaction with our lives and with the distribution of our life versus our work. So when we think about balance, it's some things we can think about in terms of actual things we can do, right? So we can prioritize the activities by having a clear mission and career trajectory, and being willing to say no. And this, obviously, saying no, there's a privilege in being able to say no to what you can and cannot say no to, but there's different ways to say no. No can be a complete sentence, but no can also be a point of negotiation. So thinking about how you say no when something comes to you, it could be no, or it could be no, but maybe I could do this. It could be no, but so-and-so might be really good for this. It might be a good opportunity for them. It could be no, not so much. I could do this piece. It could be maybe, if the deal was sweeter, what do I get out of this? Or what can I get rid of if I do this? Or, maybe if the cost benefit was clearer, if I understood a little bit more about why this was valuable, maybe I could do it. So saying no can be a really powerful point of negotiation to think about what you can get out of doing something, or it might not always be the thing that is directly pointed at, brought to you. You might be able to do something different or some variation of that when it comes to you. We're often presented with things that need to get done and someone has to do them, but it might not always be us that has to do the whole thing. So we can also think ahead by block scheduling to protect time for the things that are really crucial and important to us, and the stuff that's not deadline driven. So how can we use our schedules to block out time for the personal and the professional things that are important to us? So think about how you might use your calendar. Persist with your passion. So remember to make time for the things that are really valuable to you, because no one's going to make that time for you. So and that time becomes really valuable for mitigating burnout, because we find that the most vital faculty, the research shows that the most vital faculty have passion projects that they get to work on over time. So think about ways that you can make sure that you're connecting to those passion projects. And then the research also shows us that very vital faculty members partner with others. They collaborate a lot, and that allows them to stay in touch with priorities and professional goals. So those are some things to think about in terms of working toward balance as a way to overcome burnout. So I encourage you to think about some things that you're gonna in the future, well, in the near future. What are you gonna start doing? What are you gonna stop doing? What are you gonna keep doing? What are you going to do more and what do less of? So this is just a little activity to help you think through what are some ways that you can address behaviors based on thinking about connection and balance to address burnout specifically in your life, or thinking about ways to hopefully avoid burnout in the future. So my last thing, I just want to add some questions before we go for a few minutes of Q&A. Some questions that we really need to be asking, and we need to pick up these questions and start asking these broadly at our institutions and at our disciplinary meetings. So how can we better understand if burnout is a problem in higher ed STEM? We need to be doing the research to find out if burnout is a problem, where it's a problem, and what is causing that problem. What are the features of the culture that are causing the most stress for people, and what can we do about it? So where is the problem particularly bad, and what can we do about that particular area? So we need to be doing research on that. How can we empower our leaders, and not just our positional leaders, but non-positional grassroots leaders and people who have social capital to take up this and make change in this area of burnout specifically, and culture change around burnout directly? And then how can we support faculty who are experiencing burnout? Faculty and our staff who are experiencing burnout, without asking them to do more or asking people around them to do more, right? This is the core question. How do we help support people so that they can be well without causing more work for everyone else? How do we start addressing these behaviors? And I encourage you to think about how to ask these questions and how to answer these questions on your campuses, and think about what other questions we need to answer to move forward. So thank you for your time. We have a few minutes for questions as we wrap up. Hopefully you got some tips and some understanding a little bit more about burnout that you can take to your institution and into your groups as you think about the rest of your summer and moving into the next year. So thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Oops.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And please add any questions that you have into the Q&A section directly into Zoom, and we will try to cover them. So first off, we have how might burnout specifically affect STEM faculty different than in other disciplines?
Yeah, I think part of what it is the workload issue, because the time is so tight around when you have to be in lab. You have to be so concentrated in certain locations. You may have to be in the lab and in the classroom and in the lab with students so much that you're bound to place a lot more than maybe faculty in other disciplines are. So that place can get very, it can become its own challenge, right? It can become a place where you feel burnout more in that place. So we need to think about ways where we can make sure that we have rituals that help us move in and out of those spaces, so that we are clearing our heads, so that we are clearing our perspectives when we move in and out of those spaces, to protect ourselves and have some clarity when we move in and out of those spaces more. So I think that place being bound to that place is one big difference for STEM faculty.
Makes sense. Okay, thank you. The next question, how do you stay away from colleagues who are talking negative of the workplace? I think sometimes or all of the time, it makes the environment for all around very harsh.
Yeah, it's really difficult. That cynicism and that negativism can be really contagious, and it can be really frustrating. And sometimes it's difficult to avoid. And sometimes, and if you're not a person who is open to having a conversation with that person about their attitude, it can sometimes be worth having a conversation with the department chair about that person. And, maybe that's something that the department chair can have a conversation with that person about. Or, you find a way to figure out how you let it roll off your back and you don't take it in, right? So you have some sort of ritual where you kind of have your own self-talk about how you are not going to take in what that person is saying.
Okay, we have a couple more minutes, so I think we'll answer one more question and then I'll hand it off to April to wrap up. I guess a good closing question, what are your hopes for the future of faculty mental health and well-being in higher education?
In a lot of ways, I'm seeing some really hopeful signs. I've been doing a lot of these talking to campuses for about 3 years now, and I'm seeing a lot more campuses taking well-being seriously by having task forces doing the work of understanding faculty and staff well-being, not just student well-being on their campuses. So they're asking the right questions. They're starting to put plans into place for having real activities and programs and cohort programs for faculty and staff well-being that isn't just, here's an EAP or here's a yoga day or here's a wellness day, right? They're really taking it a lot more seriously and taking mental health a lot more seriously. So my hope is that campuses will take faculty and staff well-being seriously in a way that is accessible to all faculty and staff, that is taken seriously and is, I want to say enjoyable, like that, it's something that's fun for people to do, that connects to people, that brings connection to people as well, I think is a way to say it.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Okay, great. Well, I think at this point, yeah, invite April back on stage. Hi there, April, and I will let you close out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pope-Ruark. That was really incredible and often very touching to hear that presentation. I want to thank also to all of our attendees for being here today and sharing this space. And I want to remind everyone who's registered for this session that you will receive a bonus free invitation to a very special VIP session with Dr. Pope-Ruark called Higher Ed Leadership in a Time of Burnout. And that will take place on June 5th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So please mark your calendars for that. We'll also keep this conversation going a little bit later on our customer forum, the Labster Community Campus. And I'll ask Thomas to post a link to the campus into the chat panel so you can see how to join. And then our next conference session will begin directly on the hour. So for those who still want to register for the next session called Expanding Equity, How OpenStax and Labster Make Lab Courses More Affordable, Thomas is also sharing that Zoom link to join directly. We'll see you over there. Thank you once again, Rebecca. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.